Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2022, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters Intopia and Fable, and our Gold supporters Barrier Break, TPGI and UX for the Win. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have any questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag or post them in the YouTube chat for our Q&A at the end of the session. I'm delighted to be joined by my guest host, Mark Thiel. Over to you, Mark.
Hello, also from my area here in Krefeld, Germany. Good morning from me and hello to the world. I hope you are enjoying yourself so far. Well, and next up, we have a guest named Catherine Collins. She is founder of Moxie. And right now, if my research is right, you're in Innsbruck, Austria, right? So that's lovely. And not to waste any time, because it's always too exciting to see the talks, I pass over to Catherine and say, go for it. Enjoy your presentation, Power and Participation in Research with Catherine. Have fun.
Danke. Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are listening to this live. And for those of you who have decided to watch a replay of this talk, thanks. Today, we are going to talk about power and participation, and specifically power and participation of lived experience experts in the research and the design of products and services. And I'm going to get into some of those definitions later. But for those of you who like to know where we're going before they jump into a talk, I'm going to give you just a quick little bit of context. So first, we're going to get into power, and then we'll talk about participation as well and how they both intersect in inclusive design. And I'll share an overview of some of the different ways in which people who have lived experience can participate in a project. And then after we explore this connection, I always like to put things into context with a case study. So I'll share an example of an employee experience with houselessness that Moxie, the agency that I lead, and a local nonprofit where we came together and consulted for a professional sports stadium in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States. And a unique part of this project that we'll get into is how we included people who have lived experience of houselessness on the research team. And then after that, we get into this case study, we will talk about what we learned about power and participation through that specific experience. So as everyone said before, we're going to have time for questions at the end, so please put them in the chat. I love getting questions, and feel free to put them in as we go. But before we get into this, I'd like to tell you a little bit about me. So I'm Catherine. I'm a service designer and a facilitator. I have a social impact agency that works with organizations to understand and really act, more importantly, on what matters to their customer and their communities. And we do that through a lot of different methodologies and tools and that sort of thing. There's a photo of antlers on the screen because, not because I'm a reindeer or anything, but you might hear in my accent that I grew up in the US. And I'm from a really small town in northern Maine. And that town has a population of about 7,000 people. And it's the largest county in the state of Maine. For those of you who are wondering where Maine is, it's just north of Boston. And, but it's also the very underpopulated region where I'm from. There's very little racial diversity in the town, as well as the state overall. And I grew up middle class. I identify as a white, straight, cisgendered woman. And so I share kind of all of this contextual and identity-based information because I think it really influences how I approach design and influences, more importantly, the gaps that I likely have as a designer. And this is one of the first learnings around power and participation. We have to examine, as designers and researchers, our own participation. And to do this, we have to consider the power that we hold based off of our identities, which privilege us to certain power, and also how that influences our role in the collaboration. So for example, with this project around housing instability, I've always been housed. So there are naturally going to be gaps in addition to some of the identity-based aspects that influence my point of view, right? So, doing this type of work, examining our participation, is as much of the work as figuring out what tools and timelines and team members that we want to have as a part of a collaboration. I'm going to get into more of these specific learnings later, but I just wanted to introduce that. But now let's get into some of the concepts around participation. So first, let's talk about a concept that I mentioned earlier that really connects to participation. And that's the concept of a lived experience expert. So a lived experience expert, this is someone who at some point in their life has experienced the challenge that's being considered. So let's use an example. For example, in this particular stadium project, we were considering houselessness and how that affects employees. And in this case, then, people who had experienced houselessness were considered lived experience experts, right? But let's take another example. If we were doing, say, a research project on the patient experience with cancer treatment, patients who had cancer would be considered a lived experience expert. So you can think of a lived experience expert as someone who at some point in their life has experienced the challenge that's being considered. And obviously that can change, right? So through this talk, I'm going to specifically focus on the participation of people with lived experience. And, there are different ways that participation is referred to in a lot of different industries. So I'm going to just share a couple of those. So you may have heard the word co-creation, that's big in the service design space, co-design, design justice, inclusive design, and liberatory design. These are all either fields or terms that are used to really emphasize and are fields that really emphasize participation. But let's look at how participation kind of can vary, because I think, when I say participation, I might have a very specific idea in my mind. So this is a simple continuum that I adapted based off of Arnstein's ladder of participation. And on the left-hand side of the continuum, we have people who have lived experience, who are often the subject. And then on the right-hand side, we have the lived experience expert as an active participant. I'm going to break down what that can look like. So most design projects or projects are lived experience experts are included as the subjects. And this is the most basic. It's what we're used to. It looks like this. The researcher comes up with a couple of questions, right, that they want to ask the subject. They either do that in an interview or through other research methods that they decide to use. And in this talk, I want to consider more participatory ways. So I want to help move us further towards the right-hand side of this continuum, towards active participation. So for example, there might be cases where the lived experience expert is asked to be an advisor. And in this case, they could be giving feedback on what the researcher has learned. They could also still be participating as an interviewee, right? But they're shifting more towards an advisor. But I think what we see even less is having people with lived experience as a part of the research team and participating in the research team. And by participate, I mean they're creating interview questions, they're potentially leading interviews, and they're helping to analyze what comes out of that, what people learn from the research that they're doing. And if we take this even a step further, there's a moment where we could even ask lived experience experts to participate as a facilitator of the process. So that would be someone who's actively designing the process that the group is going through. That means they're thinking about the methods that we're using and what might be best for a certain situation. So you might be asking yourself, like, well, what's the difference between having a lived experience expert as a participant versus a subject? Why does this matter? Why can't we just continue on with what we've been doing? I mean, that's my expertise. I am the, developer or designer or researcher. Like I'm getting paid to do this. And I think the real reason why it matters is because empathy isn't enough. And I can't stress this enough. I really believe that, no amount of empathy can substitute for lived expertise. So let's imagine the cancer example I gave earlier. Let's say we're doing a research project on the patient experience with cancer treatment. There is no amount of empathy or research that would make a doctor or a researcher truly understand the patient's experience of having cancer and going through treatment, right? And there's no amount of like stepping into someone else's shoes that really can substitute for the knowledge and expertise that comes from having actually experienced that challenge. And so there are these practical reasons, like I just shared, but there are, of course, moral and ethical motivations for including people with lived experience. And, at the same time, we know that inviting someone to participate isn't enough. We can't just say, hey, we want to have you as a part of our research team and think that it'll all work out. So let's get a little into why that is. And I think the biggest reason is participation is by definition power-laden. And I really like this perspective and quote by Pettit. This is someone from the action research world. The action research world has influenced my design practice a lot. But when we bring together all these people, we're inevitably going to have to consider their participation in power. So let's say, going back to this example, if we bring people who've experienced cancer into the research team, we will have to think about how we're going to include them in the participation. There's inevitably going to be power dynamics and hierarchy that takes place. For example, patients, they might feel like they're inferior to the doctors and the researchers present in the room. Even though patients are the ones that we're trying to understand throughout the process. They're the ones who knows what it feels like to have a treatment. They know what it feels like to not know what's going to happen with their health potentially, right? Depending on the situation and so forth. But so we can't just, select the methods and tools that we think are right for this process and say like, okay, we've got the tools, we've got the methods, we've got the people. Everything's just going to work out with good intentions. We have to do this thing which Pettit and others refer to as reconfiguring power. And I really like this idea of reconfiguring power. And that's thinking about how do we address the dynamics that are present to make it a more inclusive process and to make it a more participatory one. And this is an essential element to any design process, I think, that's trying to prioritize participation and inclusion. So we talked a bit about participation in this moment just now, but I'd like to break down in a bit more detail power in the next section. So what is power? That's a big question. There's a lot of work out there around power, but there are two concepts in this next section that I'd like to get into as it relates to power specifically. So this first concept focuses on the idea that power is something that's created. So power, if we think about it, is something that as a group we create. It's a social creation. Some people refer to it as a social achievement. For example, Glenzner, and another action researcher, talks about how power is something that we as a group create, and we create it by the ways in which we relate with each other and also how we interrelate. And so I think if we consider this aspect, we can start to think about one of the ways in which we can reconfigure power. So, and one of those ways, which may be intuitive and something you've heard before, is by having groups or people who aren't traditionally considered to have power. And let's go back to our example of the patient, having opportunities for people who aren't considered to have power, opportunities for people to then express their power. So giving the patient an opportunity to express their power. And then the other side of this, it's not just about giving opportunities for people to express their power, it's also having opportunities for dominant groups, so people who have power, like doctors and researchers, having opportunities for them to first understand the power that they hold, and then second, to understand how they can share that power. So there's this element of viewing power as like a social construct, as well as a social creation. And there's also this element of viewing our role in reconfiguring it. So that's this one concept. The second concept around power that I'd like to introduce is how we view knowledge. And we know from a lot of work that's been out there that how we view knowledge determines how we relate with one another. And this concept comes from Gaventa and Cornwall, also practitioners in the action research world. And some of the stuff will be sent out after, links to these folks. But if we view knowledge only in very limited terms, for example, academic, formally trained knowledge, like does someone have a PhD, knowledge in the sense of, is it statistically significant or quantitative, that kind of thing. We view it in very limited traditional terms. That limits what we give power to. So if we view only people who have a PhD or are trained as a doctor or nurse in cancer as being the ones with knowledge in the room, then we limit the ability for people with lived experience, patients, for example, to participate and share their knowledge. And if we broaden that view of knowledge, our view of knowledge, to include lived experience, local knowledge, maybe even more expansive form of expressing that knowledge through poetry or art or story, we open up first who is given power and what they're given power to. So the second concept is all about how our views on what's considered knowledge, how that can influence what we give power to. And I think if we modify our view of what is knowledge, we can start to expand participation. So that's great, right? We can expand who can participate, and then we can start to reconfigure power. And that aspect of reconfiguring power can happen in really small ways. So for example, taking a turn is an act of power. And a collaborator of mine, Elaine Tyrone, she's a former linguistics professor. She refers to taking a turn in a conversation as an act of power. And she says this very simply, for example, when someone takes a turn to speak in a group, that's an act of power. If we also consider taking a turn to kind of change the direction of a conversation, that is also an act of power. And I share this because I think if we want really participatory and inclusive design spaces, I believe that designers are present to enable everyone to take a turn. And they're there to help reconfigure power. And for some people, that might be a little bit of a surprise of like, wait, why is that the role of the designer? And I think, we start to see with this kind of lens, the designer also acting as a facilitator of the knowledge and a curator of the knowledge that's present in that room. So, and that's not to say that a designer is no longer, creating mock-ups and delivering certain experiences, but they're not having to do it alone. And they're opening the door to participation at an earlier phase and throughout the process. So if anything, they're just having to take on another role of also facilitator. And so it's from this perspective on participation and power that we tried to facilitate an inclusive design process. And so I'm going to share an example of what that looks like, what these concepts I just talked about, what they look like in our case study. So now we're on to the practical portion of the case study. So we consulted with a sports stadium, a professional sports stadium, on an employee experience challenge that they were having. And it related to housing instability, and I'll get into that in a second. But the sports stadium was based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so for those in the United States, And for those of you who are thinking about sports stadiums or professional sports stadiums, think if you're in London, Wembley, or if you're in Tokyo, the Japan National Stadium, a large stadium that hosted professional sporting events as well as other events. And the collaboration took place, the stadium hired us to work with them, as well as a nonprofit that focused on homelessness alleviation in the Twin Cities, to partner on this challenge together. And the challenge that we focused on was how might the stadium support its current and former employees who are experiencing housing and financial insecurity. And they chose to take this challenge on because before the pandemic, the stadium had actually learned that some of their employees had experience with houselessness or were experiencing it at the time. And some of you might be wondering, like, how is that possible if you're employed to also experience houselessness? I think this particularly is germane to the context in which it took place in the US. And so since the stadium was closed, because of the pandemic, the stadium was like, okay, we want to understand some of the long-term ways that we can support employees once they come back, and also some of the short-term ways. And so they took the time to focus on this particular challenge, given the fact that their stadium was closed. And so let's talk a little bit about the stadium employees. First, some of the stadium employees are full-time, most are part-time, and some are brought into the stadium only for specific events. Not all of the employees who work at the stadium are employed by the same company. So for example, there's one company that manages the cleaning of the stadium, another manages food and beverages, and then you have temp agencies for like specific events where people get hired for just a day. And then there's one umbrella organization, a nonprofit organization that manages these different vendor companies that work in the stadium. And as I said earlier, the stadium hosts professional sports events, but they also host concerts and private events. And, to make these events happen, the stadium employees do a lot of different things. So you have employees who interact directly with guests through like ticketing and guiding guests through the space because it's such a large space. Then there are employees focused on food and beverages and snacks. And lastly, there are employees who focus on some of the behind the scenes work, like cleaning and maintaining the facility. So they partnered with Moxie, the agency I lead, Envision Community, which is a local nonprofit, to work on this challenge all together. And so now I'm going to get into the project team and our approach, because that connects directly to the work around lived experience. So let's take a look here. So on the screen, we have Janelle, Freddie, Sherry, and Rome. And these four people are the leaders of Envision Community. And that was the nonprofit partner for this project. And the leaders all have experience with houselessness. Envision, as a nonprofit, it's a housing concept, and it focuses on communal living through like tiny houses and like common spaces. And the leaders of Envision, they designed the housing concept. So they had experience with the design process before this collaboration. But during the collaboration, they were the lived experience members for the team project. So they spoke to their experience with houselessness. They also participated in the team in a lot throughout the entire design process, with recruitment of people to conducting interviews and that sort of thing. And then on the stadium side, we had 3 organizations from the stadium who also took part in the research team. And that was people from the HR departments of the organization that managed the cleaning and the food and beverage. They were on the research team with us, meeting weekly. So the entire team was made up of the Envision leaders, the 4 Envision leaders, 3 members of the stadium's HR offices, and then 2 designers from Moxie. And so the team had a blend of experience. We had lived experience in houselessness, stadium expertise, and service design experience. And I think this was really important for such a wicked problem like houselessness, right? We need multiple forms of expertise. There's not going to be one person who has all of the answers. even on the research team, right? And the lived experience experts informed the process with their experience. That it was key to have stadium employees present because they could help inform what could work from the perspective of the stadium and their own context. And then the designers from our team were there to facilitate the sessions and the workshops that we had, and also create higher fidelity versions of the ideas. So they were still doing, the designers were still doing what we would think of as traditional design work, right? In addition to facilitating the broader process. And so we worked as a team for 8 weeks, and the entire team participated in all facets of the process, which I'm going to walk through now. Whoops. So let's take a look at our process. This is just a very simple double diamond framework to give at a high level an overview of what process we took. We were hired to do the first 3 phases: discover, define, and develop. And we use tools throughout the collaboration. Designers love showing the tools. And I'm showing these not because I care so much about the tools, because I think it's not the tools that help us carry forward, but really it's how we use the tools in an intentional way with the people we have gathered. And at some point, the tools might not help, right? So, but I just wanted to put those up there to make this point that it's not always about the tools. Let's take a couple of views on our process just at a high level. So it included moments like this, where we had lived experience experts and designers and some of the stadium employees interviewing former employees via Zoom. Prior to the interviews, lived experience experts, they were really great at recruiting people to interview. And I don't think, honestly, we would have found such good candidates. So they helped with the recruitment, but then they also participated in the interviews. And then after we did some of this research on the qualitative side, we also had some high-level learnings that we had to shape, right? So there were moments like this where we processed the data and the interviews with the team. And then moments where we included an expanded group of community members, people who were working in the field of houselessness, and stadium employees as well, to come up with some ideas to the challenges we had identified in our research. And we also included interviewees in those sessions as well. Then there were moments like this where we said, okay, let's select some of the ideas, prioritize which ones we want to take further, and build them out a little bit more. So these activities aren't new to probably most of you. However, I think who we included throughout the process and how we included participants is what's a little different here. So there are, at a high level, I'm just going to run through what participation looked like. We have the 4 phases of the double diamond, and the designers participated through the first 3 parts of the process. Lived experience experts as well also did that. We had internal stakeholders who were a part of the research team, who participated in the stages with our research team, and then they also continued the work after our collaboration to test some of those ideas and that sort of thing. And then we had external stakeholders from the community, like I was just talking about, and the stadium, who weren't a part of the team, who came in at specific moments. So if you're wondering what participation looked like from a high level, that's what it looked like. But that's just the context of our case. I think what's really important for us to talk about is what we learned about power and participation through that. So that's what I want to talk about next. I'm going to cover 5 main learnings in this next section. So for those of you who like to know, and the first one is concentrating on our intention with the tools. So you just heard me say that it's not about the tools. And I think one of our main learnings is that at the same time, you can use the tools to reconfigure power. But I think this is only possible if they're facilitated in a way that really aims to reconfigure or distribute power. I'm going to explain to you what you're looking at for those of you who are wondering. This is an idea matrix. And so after the research team, after we reviewed some of the top ideas from the 2 workshops we had, we said, okay, we need to rate them some way. And we used this diagram to kind of prioritize and rate the ideas. And so if you look on the y-axis, here we measured feasibility. At the bottom, you see it says we could test this in a month. In the middle, we could test this in 6 months. And then up at the top, we could test this in a year. On the x-axis, we measured desirability, and ranging from this will help employees experiencing housing instability a little bit on the left to this will help people a lot on the right. And the lived experience experts were the decision makers for desirability. So we said, okay, you're in charge of rating the ideas on the x-axis. And then we said to the stadium staff, who are a part of the research team, you're in charge of deciding on feasibility on the y-axis. So by giving each stakeholder group an access, this helped give each group a voice, and it helped share power at the same time, because they were each in charge of rating the ideas, and it was like a negotiation, right? Like one group may have said like, this will help people out a lot. And the other may have said, well, great, but we can't test this until a year. So it helped kind of put both groups in the decision-making chair. And this is especially important because the client, in a lot of cases, is often the decision maker in moments like this, especially when it comes to ranking ideas. It may be, a couple of people from the organization, it may be, but either way, it's the client who's deciding often how to rank which ideas they want to move forward with. But at the same time, there's no way that the client can discern the desirability of a specific concept in the same way that a lived experience expert could. So anyway, using tools like this was really important because it helps first, like, make conversations visible. Very simply, we're all looking at the same thing, but it can also help redistribute power. But I think there's a nuanced part to this, which is it's not just about using the idea matrix, right? Like, you could use this idea matrix, but if you don't facilitate the tool in a way that aims to share power, then it's really irrelevant. So I like to ask myself, how can we use the tools with the aim of reconfiguring or sharing power as like an intention and as a reminder throughout the process? Our second learning that connects to the lived experience experts and their involvement in the methodology. So earlier I talked about, on the continuum that I was showing, I talked about trying to include lived experience experts in the design of the process and like of the methods as well, right? And this table is showing an example of that. So this, what you're looking at is a chart of the questions that we used after each interview to process some of the learnings and the data right off the bat. So on the left-hand side, we have the questions that were created by the other designer and I. And then the after section on the right-hand side, that's after we got feedback from a lived experience expert. So for example, let's take that first section. We had the first row where we had the question, or the more like the comment, things the participants said that surprised you, or most memorable quotes. That was like something that we wanted people to reflect on after the interview. And instead we rephrased that with the lived experience expert to what caught your attention during the interview. And this came about because the lived experience expert shared with me after one of the interviews. He said, Catherine, sometimes the designers use big words and words that not everyone can understand. And he was sharing this on behalf of like the conversations he had had with other members of the lived experience expert group. And so I asked him, I was like, all right, great. Like, thank you for telling me that. This is really helpful. How can we rephrase some of these questions to make them better? Because, obviously I'm used to using my design jargon and language that's not necessarily accessible and familiar to everyone. So we had several other moments like this in the process where lived experience experts gave input on the methods. We did this before an ideation workshop and a couple of other situations. But it's so important to include lived experience experts in the adaptation and even the creation of some of these methods for a couple of reasons. I think it really helps affirm their participation in the process. It's saying, I'm not just asking you to participate with your expertise and to receive the methods and activities and just like jump through all the activities we've designed. But I'm asking for your genuine input on how we're doing these activities and if you think these activities are accessible to the rest of the group. So it helps move us further towards that active participant part of the continuum. Another learning that we had, this is our third learning, relates to moments, this idea of creating moments for participation. So we learned throughout the process that we needed to create multiple engagement points. So I would have weekly one-on-one calls with each of the leaders. And this happened after our weekly research team meeting, which was like a group meeting. And this approach of creating multiple engagement points, I think it can be compared to one of the inclusive design principles of creating a comparable experience or an additional experience to make it accessible. And I really like that framing of it that the inclusive design principles have. And so, we did this because the lived experience experts, they're really busy. I mean, they had different activities that were going on that would influence their ability to participate or be fully present in our meetings. So for example, one lived experience expert did a lot of street outreach, meaning they would go, they would drive in their car. They'd often take phone calls and Zoom meetings from their car because they were going out to see what resources people needed. And they were often, doing that street outreach. Another lived experience expert was in a rehabilitation program for a back injury. So he was, he would often have nurses or doctors check in on him during the calls or someone to deliver food. And so all of these little moments influenced people's ability to participate at times. So we had these one-on-one meetings if someone had missed something or had to jump off early as an opportunity for the lived experience experts to be present, to review some of the information, and also just have a one-on-one time to connect and give feedback in a way that they may not have done in the larger group. Now, this was very hands-on. I'm not going to lie. It took more time and it was more effort, but it was really worth it and improved our process. So we did this. There was challenges around, creating multiple. We did this to mitigate some of the challenges to participation, but there were other challenges like access to technology that we tried to support. So this aspect, I think I almost considered not including it because I felt like it was perhaps maybe even a intuitive or obvious insight, but I think it's really important to consider the things that sometimes feel unsexy. And this connects to technology. So some of the lived experience experts had different access to technology and experience with technology. So at the beginning of our project, we had like a session that focused on like how to use Zoom functions like muting and sharing your screen or writing in the chat. And we tested a few whiteboard tools. But then we also still had certain challenges around internet access and having a stable internet connection. So there were things that we could have even done, like providing hotspot access from the beginning that would have helped. But I guess I share this learning because I think asking yourself the question, what tech challenges might people have, and what are some of the obvious, maybe obvious to me, kind of logistical challenges that people might have that could be considered to help the team participate in the long run. Another insight we had was in learning was connected to check-in and connection exercises. So some people might roll their eyes and be like, oh gosh, like of course you did check-in and connection exercises. But I think those were really important to help reconfigure power. So we started a majority of our sessions like this with a check-in exercise. People would be in pairs or in small groups, or we might do it as a larger group. And I know that it can feel a little risky to include these types of relational or centering exercises, especially in corporate environments. If your client is a corporate client, you might be a little bit nervous about the corporate team members being annoyed, or even people outside of the corporate team, but like other stakeholder groups being annoyed if you're taking the time to check in and talk about people's feelings and who they are. And a collaborator of mine, Alfredo Ortiz Aragon, says something that I really love. He says, at the end of the day, these exercises don't remove power differences, which I think is true. They don't remove the power differences, but they can reconfigure, again, back to that idea of reconfiguring. They can reconfigure ways of relating with each other and connecting. And I think this is so true. And using these exercises was important for a couple of reasons. First, they made sure that everyone had the chance to take a turn and to share their story at the beginning of every session. And this helps set up for the group the idea that we want to hear from everyone. We want to hear that your story is important, right? And worth hearing. And, there's studies that found that if people participate in the first 5 minutes, they're more likely to participate later in a meeting or a workshop. So doing these kind of exercises at the beginning can help encourage people to participate later on. And it also helped create relationships between the group that tried to extend beyond some of those power differences. And I think this is one of the biggest learnings when working with a blended research team. And I think it can be, tempting to just conform to the most powerful meeting style. But instead, it can be helpful to let your partner, your corporate partner or client know, like, hey, this meeting is going to be a little different. And we're going to use some specific exercises to help set the group up. And, you can tell them things like, these exercises are important because, first off, they change the meeting style in a way that's beneficial for everyone, not just the dominant group or the convener. And then 2, they increase engagement. And when we have better engagement, we inevitably have better decisions, products, services, and so forth. And the last aspect that I'm just going to share briefly here is the concept, going back to the beginning, that designers and researchers, we cannot expect the participation of communities without examining our own participation. So how are we contributing to the power dynamic, and how do we want to shift that? And to do that, we have to consider our role in creating power. Where are some of our lived experiences personally and assumptions and biases influencing us? And, in retrospect, to be a little self-critical here, we could have benefited from doing this a bit more. The 2 designers got together and we considered this aspect. We talked about it as a pair, but we never talked about it with the entire group. And I think having more training and ability to do this is key. So let's take a look at the summary just to wrap things up. I find that it can be helpful to ask these questions throughout a design process, and specifically at the beginning. So first, our first takeaway, how am I using the tool with the aim of sharing power? It's about not just the tools, but the intention and the facilitation of those tools. Am I designing the methods with lived experience experts? And if so, how? And then how can we create multiple engagement points so that people can participate in a more accessible way? What's everyone's level of tech access and tech literacy? And then also, what are there other logistical aspects that I should be considering? And then second to last, how can we use connection and relational exercises to reconfigure some of the ways of relating within the group? And lastly, how are we all contributing to the power dynamic, and what do we want to do to reconfigure that? So we aim to work in this way for many reasons, and encourage you to push some of your perceptions on what it means to be a designer or a project leader, and to go beyond empathizing to designing together. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen. And now we'll get into questions. If you and also if you want to reach out to me, my information's here. Feel free. I'm happy to always chat after this.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was wonderful. So do we have any questions, Mark?
Yes, we have actually. First of all, I'd like to say thank you as well. It's such an important topic, and really, it's great to be reminded of things like this, because oftentimes you are so much in your bubble, in your own bubble, that you forget about other things. But let's get to questions. Kate was asking, how do you convince stakeholders of the need for including lived experience experts? Thinking of pushbacks, for example, where it takes more time and resources to engage in this deep work.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because some people are having to push and convince people to do interviews and talk to their customer at the first place, right? So if you're saying like, oh no, we want to include people on the research team. And I mean, first off, let me just say, I started with the continuum of participation for a reason. You're not going to necessarily be able to start with like lived experience experts as full-on research team members, maybe in your first engagement or your first project. If you are, great, but I think there can be ways to start small. I found that it's helpful to tell people and to reiterate that there's no amount of lived experience or that can there's no amount of research that can substitute from engagement with lived experience experts, right? There's no amount of empathy that will get us there. And so there's that aspect, but then there's the aspect around like, you actually end up saving time in the long run. It might take a little bit of time, investment and resources to start, but you're not going to waste time thinking about, oh, well, what's the best question for us to ask? Like or let's try out a few of these questions with a few of the interviewees and then adapt based off of what we learned, right? Like, of course you might still have to do that, but you're going to have a lot better and better informed research questions or even prototypes before you go to test them as a result of including lived experience experts. And I also just want to say, you should always pay lived experience experts to be a part of the research team.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, empathy, you're talking about this, right, is really important already. I think it's a good starting point to have empathy and try to understand the other person, or like the person who is actually in the situation. For example, my brother died of cancer, and I always tried to understand like what he feels like and what he might experience. And even though I had a good idea of what he might experience, I would never be able to really understand what he and his family went through. So it is like key to like really understand this, right? So empathy is great, but it will never like be like the one person who has cancer in this matter. So did you ever experience difficulties in teaching people with power, like doctors, for example, to understand that they actually have power? And what's your approach to make them understand this and maybe get lived experience experts in?
Yeah, I think, yes. So I think there's definitely the challenge of educating people with power, on the fact that they have power, right? Because sometimes that can just be assumed or taken for granted, right? Like, or deemed invisible, like, oh, I don't really actually have power, I just know this, right? So first, I think it's important making explicit the relationship between knowledge and power, right? So going back to what I was saying earlier, how do you view the knowledge? How do you view what is valid and knowledge, right? So asking doctors or whoever the stakeholder is to kind of take an intake, to kind of do an intake with them to understand like what's their worldview on knowledge. And there's different exercises and questions that you can use to do that. But it definitely takes conversations and level setting with those with power to create that kind of awareness, for sure. And some people will have that awareness going into it, and that might be part of the reason why they're engaging you.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, it needs people like you to remind people that they have power. Sometimes, as you say, like you don't really know that you have power, but if you remind people and point that out, it helps understanding this and makes people aware of that. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. I mean, I could talk about this kind of stuff forever, like have a conversation, but we need to wrap up, sadly. I'm pretty sure people can reach out to you, as you said already. They can see your email address on the last slide, the thank you slide. Saying thank you is what is left for me. Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you everybody for watching and taking part in it. And well, have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Mark. If you like this session, hit that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop for our future events. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Inclusive Design 24 2022 is brought to you with thanks to our supporters: Intopia, Fable, Barrier Break, TPGI, UX for the Win, Equal Entry, InfoAxia, Intuit, the Law Office of Laney Feingold, Adrian Roselli LLC, and WebAble. We will be back on the hour with our next session, where Johan Huykman will be talking to us about the indisputable truth about accessibility, and we hope to see you then.